Welcome to Hypothesize That, the podcast where science meets speculation and where the future of medicine is always up for debate. I'm your host, Nicola Hill. Today we'll be discussing the modern engineered versions of multi-specific therapies, medicines designed to target several disease pathways at the same time instead of just one. They're like a smart tool with multiple functions. Instead of carrying separate tools for each job, it's one tool that can do many things at once. Now, we've had single targeted therapies for a long time now, but as always, there's drawbacks. Drugs designed to act against individual targets can't usually battle multigenic diseases. So our hypothesis? That within the next decade, single-target drugs will become the exception rather than the norm, as multi-specific therapies revolutionise drug discovery by enabling more effective, personalised and resilient multi-target therapies, rendering traditional approaches increasingly obsolete. So, joining me to unpack this hypothesis are Professor Raj Chovatiya, who's the Associate Professor at Rosalind Franklin University of Medicine and Science, Chicago Medical School, and founder and director of the Center for Medical Dermatology and Immunology Research in Chicago, Illinois in America. Welcome, Raj. And also Dr Joe Rastrick, Head of Resolving Inflammation at UCB. Welcome, Joe.
Hi, Nicola. Hi, Raj.
I think one question that maybe is quite handy to clarify for those listening is why would multi-specific therapies be better than the broad spectrum drugs that we have at the moment that presumably do hit more than one pathway?
So the broad spectrum drugs are very effective. They come with their own challenges, and maybe the trade-off between possible adverse effects and the level of efficacy seen isn't always worth it depending on what the disease is. But if you hit too many pathways, you may impact the immune system too much. Whereas a multi-specific approach just targets the pathways we believe are driving disease and not the pathways that are actually keeping you healthy.
Part of the challenge with broad spectrum acting medications is by virtue of them being broadly acting, they must have some degree of promiscuity is the word that we're looking for across targets in the body. And for that to be the case, they can't entirely be too specific, right? Many of these inhibit enzyme pathways or proteins that share common features. And by virtue of the fact that you may have things that you want to be regulated, but you may also have things that you don't want to be regulated. You don't have the degree of ability to control. And so that's why we end up seeing a lot of different side effects with some of our most broadly acting therapies, even if there's a clinical rationale for their use.
So what would you both say then are the key factors that are actually driving this shift in drug discovery? I mean, maybe that's one for you first, Raj.
You know, there's a number of factors that I think about that are really getting us to this point today. We have the technology both to understand the targets we want, how to design medications for the targets themselves, clinical understanding of what the deficiencies are in our current generations of therapies. And those three things together have really spurned revolutionary medicine in this area of multispecifics.
And with that advent of new technology and more single-targeted therapies, we just have an abundance of data now that we can access to give us a better insight into disease pathology. And we historically view diseases based on the organ system or the tissue that they affect, so skin disease, gut disease, joint disease. But actually now with all of this data, we can start moving towards a system of disease classification where we can talk about a particular pathway, IL-17-mediated disease, TNF-mediated disease, IL-13-mediated disease. And what we see is actually if different single-targeted therapies in the same disease can achieve the same level of efficacy. And that tells us there's that inbuilt redundancy in the immune system. So what happens if you put those two therapies together? Do you get an additive response or a synergistic response, or do they counteract each other? And that's the work that we've been doing before these drugs get to the clinic. And now they're in the clinic, we're going to see if that actually translates to value to the patient.
Okay, so We know there's a growing need for better and more sophisticated treatments for multifactorial diseases, and that drugs that just work on one specific target have their own limitations. Are multi-specific drugs the be-all and end-all?
Great question. And I think that it really depends on what period in time you might ask. As if we thought about medicine a longer time ago, we might say that, you know what, if we can figure out what one gene problem causes, it might lead to one specific disease. And if we can fix that one downstream issue, we then might be able to fix the disease state itself. And that applies to several different processes. But what we've learned in many of the diseases of today, many of the chronic inflammatory conditions that we deal with, it's not quite so simple. And there probably isn't just a single target or a single gene that needs to be corrected to really be able to get people back to living their best life. So honestly, if you ask me, for some of the most common conditions of today, the idea of a multimodal, multi-specific therapy seems to really be the wave of the future.
Let me come to you, Joe. I mean, how would you really explain what multi-specific therapies are?
So in their simplest form, we can think of a multi-specific therapy as a biologic therapy, so like an antibody, which typically is like a capital Y shape. So it has two arms which bind the target. So what we do in multi-specific therapies is we take one of those arms and we make it bind something else. So there has two arms which bind two different targets. And you can add more arms onto these therapies, and that adds more complexity and other problems or challenges to overcome. But ultimately, you can really design molecules that can target several different pathways.
But I remember when we first heard about these single target therapies, this was like personalised medicine at its best. This was going to be the big cure. I mean, from what you've described and from what you said, Raj, that's not necessarily the case then.
Yeah, it's not always so simple. So I'll give you a really great example coming from the skin world. One of the more common chronic skin diseases that we deal with in dermatology is something called psoriasis. It's a condition where people get thick, very flaky, scaly patches on their skin and can have a lot of discomfort leading to poor quality of life. Now, as it turns out, we learned with some of these biologic therapies, truly revolutionarily, if we end up just binding to one specific target and do a really good job of it, we can actually get people feeling a lot better, have the signs and symptoms of their disease under near complete control, and really don't require multiple different targets. And it just turned out that in this disease state, it was really that straightforward. But what we've learned in subsequent decades, this isn't necessarily the rule across all diseases. And there's other conditions where it may not be so straightforward. If you simply just get one thing back in line, everything else may not completely correct itself.
Yeah, that's not that surprising, really, I suppose, Joe, is it? Because, I mean, life isn't as simple, so diseases aren't that simple.
And it's actually a really good thing in a way, because our immune system is built to handle this. So our immune system, if something goes wrong with one arm of our immune system, the other arm can take over and continue to keep us healthy. It's just that in disease, when one arm is driving disease, often another arm can take over to drive disease if you just shut down one arm. But I think Raj's example of psoriasis is a really great example, and there are other diseases where a single targeted therapy has been less effective. But let's not, forget that these single target therapies have revolutionized how patients have been treated over the last 2 to 3 decades. They have been incredible. But what we always strive for in science is what's the next wave of innovation? How can we improve on what's already there? And I think that's really the landscape where the multi-specific therapies are starting to occupy.
And that's a great point, Joe, because when we think about the whole purpose of why the immune system evolved, it was really to allow us to protect ourselves from a whole host of diverse stimuli that we might face in the world. And from person to person, everyone may not have the exact same immune system, but we would hope is that there's a certain level of redundancy built in many of these different pathways that allow us to be able to have an adequate response. So it isn't surprising that if one part of your immune system were to not be completely playing nicely, others could really take into account and take its place. And so that is the real reason why in many of our current diseases, multiple targets really might be necessary in order to get ourselves back to line.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes it requires doubling down on the same pathway. So maybe one target just doesn't quite hit that pathway enough. And other times, as you say, it's those two distinct non-redundant pathways which might be driving disease in different ways. So this is where you can tailor the multispecific biologics to combat different diseases.
How many targets do you think you actually need, though, for a disease? I mean,
well, that really comes down to that term Raj used, the heterogeneity of disease, because some diseases are so incredibly complex. And I think of one, Raj, in dermatology, hidradenitis suppurativa, which has got so many different processes going on, both inflammation and tissue remodeling. And these diseases likely will require possibly more than two pathways. We will see how successful these multispecifics are, but we can begin to build the complexity as we generate more data. But certainly the next wave is, I believe, truly exciting.
Can we give some examples then, perhaps, of the ones that you think would really benefit?
Yeah, I was going to say a really one that's near and dear to my heart, and I think Joe's as well, would be a common condition called atopic dermatitis or eczema, one of the most common chronic skin conditions. Those of you guys might be familiar with this as a condition where people get dry, itchy, red patches of skin that can come and go on different parts of the body. And it really is one of the more prevalent conditions we see around the world. As it turns out, it's actually quite complex. And while there seem to be a few major drivers of this disease, simply just being able to stop one pathway or even a couple pathways doesn't apparently appear to be enough to get individuals under really good control and relief from a lot of the itch, sleep difficulties, and rash that they face.
And I think that atopic dermatitis is a great example. And there are treatments that can actually hit very broad immunology and multiple pathways. But actually, sometimes these modalities are associated, our mechanisms of action are associated with side effects. And so where the multispecifics fit in is actually the selective targeting of the right targets in the right patient population to try and get the level of efficacy that we hope for, but actually by minimizing the adverse effects.
So how are you guys going to know which disease needs multi-specific therapies?
Well, we've learned that there's a lot of systems biology, artificial intelligence, and probably just omics, which is the big fancy word that we use to describe how we look at the entire library of lipids in the body, proteins in the body, genes in the body. And our ability to really understand the big picture has grown astronomically, and it continues to year by year. And while that presents us with some scientific challenges, the benefit is quite palpable, where we may actually be able to understand what are possible nodes where we can intervene in a logical way to be able to correct disease states. What do you think, Joe?
I think with the advent of much more clinical data as well, with these single targeted therapies, some diseases are treated very well. Psoriasis, the majority of patients can achieve clear skin. There are still some patients who struggle to get that level of efficacy, but moving from where we once were with psoriasis to where we are now, it's clear that there's a very dominant pathway. In atopic dermatitis, for example, those single targeted therapies still leave a level of efficacy on the table. And so how can we really move that efficacy bar much higher? And that's one signal that there may be space for a multispecific antibody if a clear dominant pathway is inhibited, but it doesn't achieve full efficacy. And ultimately, we want to get more patients into clinical remission and lasting clinical remission as well. So if you can identify that efficacy gap, maybe coupled then with the advancements in technology that Raj was talking about, these omics technologies where you can look at the entire genome and look at what genes are dysregulated and what genes are corrected by the drug and what genes are not impacted by the drug but remain dysregulated. And that gives us a clue in research to start saying, okay, well, maybe what happens if we target that one dominant pathway plus this pathway?
Do you think the day will come, Raj, when you'll be able to give a patient a drug that will work on 6 or 7 or 2 pathways that they need?
I think that day might be closer than you think. There are actually investigational therapies that are trying to target numbers of pathways beyond 2 or 3, even 6 or 7 as well. So there isn't a doubt in my mind that there will be some disease states where that will be an optimal strategy. I perhaps don't want to overspeak and say that's going to be the total strategy of this idea that more is better. It's really going to depend on the disease state itself.
Okay, thank you. You briefly mentioned AI. I can imagine the use of new technologies is you're very dependent upon this. So I presume then it is thanks to the development of new technologies that allow you to go in this direction now.
There's certainly, so with AI and machine learning and digital technologies, there's a level of hype which may or may not come to fruition, but there's no doubt that what it's offering is game changing. And this is a whole podcast in its own right, because the way the AI and machine learning is impacting all sorts of businesses, especially in healthcare and life sciences, it is astronomical. And it's one of the biggest advancements possibly since the Industrial Revolution, certainly since monoclonal antibody therapies. And so how we implement these technologies in the right way is going to be one of the challenges. But I think there's so much space for those technologies in what we do.
Yeah, I think you're right. It is definitely a podcast in its own right. Raj, what impact is this going to have on personalised medicine? Maybe you can explain exactly how multi-specific therapies do advance personalised medicine.
Absolutely. And, with the advent of most of our modern therapies, I think that we all thought it was going to be time to hang the mission accomplished banner. We got everybody treated and life was going to be great. And for a number of patients, it truly has been. But I think what really is missing is this idea of, if a patient was to come to see me in the clinic, based on the profile and factors in front of me, am I going to be able to reasonably predict what is the right medication for the right patient? And I think in some cases we are able to do that. In many cases, we still can't get there. And part of the problem is the limitations of our current medicine design being simply made around a single target that may not be applicable to every single patient. So if one was to be able to design a next generation medication that allows to really hit on multiple pieces of a disease state that could then get more individuals not only having a clinically meaningful response, but a clinically deep, meaningful response, we might be able to actually remit disease in a far greater number of our patients.
And I'm sorry if this question comes from ignorance here, gentlemen, but I'm asking, you're targeting different pathways, more than one pathway with these new types of therapies. In, say, me or Joe Raj, would we be wanting to target the same pathways, or would you be able to specify the ones that fit with how a disease is affected in my body compared to how a disease is affected perhaps in Joe's body?
It's a great question. And this really ties into Joe's point about our ability to now have the data to make these types of decisions and design medications that could perhaps tailor what we need for the individual. So there are some disease states where it appears like if you were to target the right 2 or 3 pathways, you might be able to work for a great number of patients. There's other disease states that are far more heterogeneous, is the word we like to use, where things can be a bit different from patient to patient. That would be the circumstance with next generation platforms where we can make medications quite efficiently and quite targeted, where having a different multi-specific therapy may make sense for one patient to another. Part of the challenge with previously broad-acting therapies is while they have the ability to help more people, you oftentimes are taking a trade-off on possible side effects or adverse events that you really don't want to experience. And even if there's a small risk of that, it's a hard sell for any patient to think about safety issues with a therapy that might potentially help them and others achieve high levels of response.
Now, this actually brings us to the challenge, really, of our hypothesis that, there's always a downside, isn't there, Joe? I mean, I can imagine one of the complications of something that's working on 2 pathways is you could have different side effects, couldn't you? It might work in fact, tell me, is this right? Is there a change in side effects when it's working on 2 pathways?
It's absolutely something that has to be considered and monitored. So any drug which targets the immune system will obviously impact part of your immune system and may make you susceptible to infections and other side effects. However, through rigorous drug testing, those are mitigated or minimized as much as possible, and at least we should be aware of them so that Raj and physicians can talk to the patients about those risks. Now, the broader the immunology that you capture with any drug, then yes, of course, there's possibly more risk. But actually what we we tend to see is that with the right pairings, then you can minimize these. And so the risk is often just equivalent to what you would see with targeting a single pathway. But that will very much depend on the pairing. And these multispecifics are still in clinical development at the moment. So we're talking about sort of like the frontier of a new wave of medicines coming through. And this is why it's great to have Raj here. Dermatitis is the ground where these are the most advanced. And I think that also provides other complications for physicians as well, because with so many new therapies in clinical development, if they all get approved, how are you going to decide which patient to treat with which modality? And I think that comes back to what you were talking about with precision medicine and these technologies, is can you identify the right patient to treat with the right drug? Or does a multispecific actually capture a broader range of patients?
Did you want to add something to that, Raj, or are you confident that you'll know which is the right drug for which patient?
It will still take time. I think that our ability to understand diagnostically and even predictively with biomarkers exactly from a clinic standpoint in a very short visit how I can connect the right medication to the right patient is still going to be a long-term ongoing challenge. But to Joe's point, what we've learned in a disease state like atopic dermatitis or eczema, based on some of the newer therapies we've had, is that if you're highly targeted in terms of going after a specific target, let's say in the case of a biologic therapy, you can help a fair number of people. Not everyone, but you can do so pretty safely. If you take a slightly different approach and go with a tablet that inhibits a lot of different things that are going on in the immune system, you might be able to help some more people have a better response, but there's definite real safety trade-offs. So multispecifics are really about threading that needle to be able to figure out the select specific points in the immune system that really can be modulated to balance the high level of effectiveness.
I think threading the needle is it's trying to find that Goldilocks space, right? Just right, the right targets and the right patient to have that right benefit risk profile for the indication. Of course, that benefit risk will change depending on the indication, right? So like an area where the multispecifics have already been approved is oncology, which has a very different benefit risk profile to something like atopic dermatitis. But utilizing what we've learned in that space, we're now transitioning into immune-mediated inflammatory diseases to try and bring greater value and greater clinical remission to patients with these diseases.
What are the other challenges, though? I mean, as you said, this is the forefront. This is a new, completely new type of medicine, which is great and it's exciting. And I know our listeners will be really pleased because we want to hear that. We want better treatments. And I think anybody with eczema completely is going to agree with that one. But I know you've got other challenges, haven't you? You've got technological challenges that you've got to overcome.
For sure. So a monoclonal antibody was once viewed as complex, but now most companies are very effective and efficient at generating monoclonal antibody therapies. Now, as you engineer these biologic therapies to a greater degree, they become more complex. So one, you're targeting more complex biology because you're targeting multiple pathways. So mechanistically understanding what happens with this drug is more complicated. The modality, i.e. the structure of the drug, is more complicated to make as well. We have to consider any additional adverse effects that we might come across. But we also need to consider something called immunogenicity. And that's when your body's own immune system can recognize the drug and try and clear it more rapidly. Because it's recognizing a foreign body, which could be a pathogen in your body. Now, there are ways to try and mitigate that risk as well. But anything which is more highly engineered will appear more foreign to the body.
Wow. Quite a lot of complications then, definitely.
It's a lot to think about, for sure.
What about regulatory? I mean, that's something that I've heard can be a bit of a challenge. Raj, is that something that you're concerned about?
It's a concern with any medication development process, especially when there's new technology, because to even build on what Joe was talking about, even within the category of multispecifics, there's not even necessarily an agreement on what exactly is the best design for a multispecific therapy. So to sort of go back to the building block example that Joe was giving, are you going to take one of these little molecules that looks like a Y shape and add a bunch of heads on it? Are you going to combine a bunch of Ys together into one medication? Are you going to require a Y shape plus maybe sort of a small soluble molecule, some sort, to work with it? And so on and so forth. And so even the actual building blocks of putting together the therapy are not totally agreed upon. And when that's the case, it usually means that the regulatory path forward is going to have some challenges, as there isn't a clear gold standard to follow, as we do in some of our more conventional therapies.
And this is a new path we're treading. And as I said, atopic dermatitis seems to be one of the areas where these therapies are most advanced. But an example is, do we have to demonstrate that one arm of the drug is not as efficient as targeting both arms? So targeting one pathway is less efficient at driving efficacy as targeting two pathways with the multispecific drug. Now, if one of those drugs is already approved in that indication and exists and is well established and clinically validated, then that's great. You can do a head-to-head study and show that that drug is equivalent or less equivalent as the multispecific, and you'd only want to progress to multispecific if it's better than one arm of the drug alone. However, if neither of the arms are approved in that indication, what do you do? How do you prove that targeting two pathways is better than targeting one pathway? Do you develop a drug that only targets one arm, even though you never actually intend to take that through to the clinic? Because, it's tens of millions just to get a molecule to the clinic, let alone actually running those trials. And so how do we navigate that? And that's where we're working with regulators to understand what the pathway is to bring these drugs to market.
And the trial enterprise is so expensive and complicated, you can imagine that simply just running a placebo or sort of an arm where there's no treatment versus an arm of treatment. Now, if your treatment actually is composed of several different treatments, you may have to have multiple arms, meaning that you have hundreds of more patients in your studies, more money, more time, more resources, more investigators, potentially more problems.
That's very interesting, because I just thought, why can't you run this as a normal trial? This is a new treatment compared to gold standard or placebo, but obviously it's more complicated than that. Okay, gentlemen, I think we've talked about the positives. We've talked about the challenges that you've certainly got to overcome. Can I just ask you both then briefly, do you really believe that this is the forefront of medicine and that these are what we really need? I'm presuming the answer is yes, but maybe you can summarise why you're so enthusiastic about them both. Shall I start with you, Joe?
Sure. So my answer is yes. So I'm very passionate about these multispecific molecules and the advancements that I hope they will make to patient care. They have their challenges, but ultimately we're trying to design something that creates much more value and greater efficacy for patients. And that's what we intend to do. We've been working on these for a number of years, and we've had a lot of learnings on how to develop these molecules correctly to get them to the stage where they are now. Now, we're already working on the next wave of innovation. So I do strongly feel that when these molecules are approved, provided all the clinical studies work out, then they will be the next wave of innovation.
So Raj, are these the best treatment options that you're hoping are going to be available for your patients in the future?
So I shared Joe's optimism, but I'll keep us grounded for just a second, right? So, there's still a lot of questions about whether or not, as you start to add more targets to a therapy, does your effect become additive, right? Does 1 + 1 = 2? Is it synergistic? Is 1 + 1 going to equal 3? Or is there going to be a certain level of redundancy where 1 and 1 is simply going to still just be 1? And I think we can all understand that any one of these possibilities is still on the table. And so there is a lot we have to learn. I'm taking the approach that I think that we're going to probably find out that there are indeed some combinations and some disease states where this really is going to be game changing. And so really can't wait to see what happens over the next decade.
Thank you. That's very. You've definitely sort of managed to stay on the fence a little bit there.
Tempered my enthusiasm, Raj.
Tempered your enthusiasm. Okay, well, that's been a really interesting discussion. It seems the future of drug discovery is likely to involve a hybrid approach where multi-specific therapeutics and single-target therapies will coexist, each serving specific roles. Certainly that's Joe's belief, definitely. He's very optimistic about this. And we do have to understand, as Raj said, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. And of course, there are areas where the single-target drugs will remain essential. But all these opportunities for innovation will hopefully help achieve the ultimate goal, which of course is to improve patients' outcomes. Thank you for listening to Hypothesize That. Thanks to Raj and to Joe for joining me on this podcast. As always, we want to hear from you. What do you think? Are multi-specific therapies going to redefine modern medicine? Join the conversation on social media using the hashtag HypothesizeThat. We'll be back next time with another bold hypothesis. Until then, stay curious.